In this example, we're gonna create this car on fire. This one also got a lot of love on social media, got retweeted and reshared by Jenga FX. So this will be a larger scale simulation. We're also gonna add some GPU particles for these little embers. Let's jump right into it. Alright, so as always, we're starting with a blank scene. I just imported my basic passenger car with no windows. So I deleted the geometry in my 3D software, so there's no windows. Change the color to white, and I can tell you that originally when I made it, I ended up setting the scale of the car to 400% because I really wanted to get across the large scale nature of this fire and I wasn't really getting it. So I'm gonna need this to be a pretty big grid. So simulation size, I did 250 by 125 by 150. But we'll set the voxel size to be 0.2 meters instead of 0.1 meters. So I'll just move the car slightly to the edge of it because I know that the fire will be sort of coming from right to left. Maybe let's just make the car scale 350%. So I'll just move this out of the way, and next we'll need an emitter volume for our fire and smoke. Give it a shape, and we're gonna do shape blend. I'll tell you why in a second. And for shape A, I want to do a primitive. Let's make it a rounded box. And for shape B, I want it to be a noise. And let's just turn this volume off and make a collider. And so I want this to be the emitter. And after a bunch of back and forth, I was getting the best result when I just had this little rectangle emit fire right under the roof. So what I'll do is set the height to be very small. So you can set it to 0. So it's just this flat rectangle box, and just make sure that it fits nicely into the car. So change the scale on the X and Y, and you can put it right inside of the car under the roof. So I'll delete the collider and enable my emitter again. So the thing about this effect is that it's all about variation. That's how you're gonna make it look way more realistic, is if there's a variety of velocity coming out of the car. Maybe there's little explosions going off. There's a lot of fire coming at one point and then just a little bit. So we're gonna try and randomize everything we can about this. And using the shape blend is one of the ways to do that. So if I go into the emitter volume and just turn off the emission for everything and just say visuals show emitter, right now the emitter is just broken up with the noise. So we can maybe increase the noise a little bit to create some holes in this emitter, something subtle, maybe 1.5. And we can increase the animation speed just a little bit. So I think I ended up doing around 0.2. And now as you start the simulation, you see how the holes, it's a bit hard to see right now, I know, but the holes inside of this emitter are sort of moving around because of that animated noise. So that's gonna give us some variation for the emitter. Maybe we can set the animation speed to 0.4. So back in the emitter volume, we can hide the emitter, go back to emission. Let's enable our fuel emission. And I wanna set this to around 500%. But of course, nothing's gonna show up unless there's no temperature. So let's also enable the temperature and enable the smoke emission. And now we have a big ball of smoke being created. So let's set the smoke rate to 40%. And we need the fire to sort of be coming out of the windows and have some velocity to it. So I'll give it an additional pressure rate of 30%. I did 40% for the random intensity. And we can lower the temperature to maybe around 4000 Kelvin. All right, and it's definitely exploding for some reason. Probably the additional pressure rate might be too much. So I'll just lower that. Let's just try 10. And I'll increase the random intensity to 50. But also there's no buoyancy in the scene right now. So it's just, you know, there's nothing making the fire and the smoke go up. If we go under simulation force and increase the buoyancy to maybe 10%, it's gonna look much better. But actually, instead of buoyancy, I wanna just push it with a line force so it goes to the side, like it's affected by wind. So I'll set the buoyancy back to 0, and instead we'll make a new line force over here. And I'll just rotate it into the corner of my grid like this, and set the push strength to maybe 0.1. And hopefully this will look pretty decent at this point. Okay, maybe we can push it up more. And I think let's just do 0.07. Cool, so that's starting to look normal. We just need to break it up way more. So emitter volume, I will increase the additional pressure rate again to 30 and see if it's still exploding. And it is still exploding, so I'll just do maybe 20, set the random to 40. Okay, I think it might be exploding because of the noise over here. So I'll just decrease the animation speed to just 0.2, maybe decrease the scale to 1.2, decrease the amplitude a little bit, see if that helps. Yeah, that helps a little bit. So now we need to add some noise to this so it doesn't look like a candle. So I'll just drag out a noise straight out of the emitter. I want to break up the emitter, so noise. Okay, already much better. But I think the scale is too big of the noise, so let's just lower that. Let's try 4.5. Maybe we can increase the amplitude a little bit to make it stronger. Maybe decrease the animation speed a little. You know, this is actually pretty fast in real life, right? This is not a volcano. This is still just a car. And if you've ever seen footage of a car on fire, the fire is still pretty fast. So I think this is actually a pretty correct speed for something like this, but I want even more noise. So I'll just copy this one, paste. I'll connect this one to the entire simulation node. So now it will obviously mess everything up, but I'll just connect the mask shape to the car so that the noise is only applied basically inside of the car. So now if I reset, it's pretty broken up and violent inside of the car. You can tell by the smoke, but it's not being affected up here anymore. It's only affected down here. And I think I really just want more smoke. So let's crank up the smoke rate to maybe 100. And we're gonna play with the shading later to make the smoke much thicker. Now what I wanna do is just add those GPU particles flying out of the windows. So we can just add another emitter, make it emitter particles. I will copy my shape primitive over here, paste it over here, connect it to my emitter. So here are my GPU particles. Let me just move this inside of the car, maybe a bit lower so they are flying out of the window nicely. And I don't want them to be affected by the fire as strongly. I want them to sort of be falling down. So we can go into the emitter, active forces, volume. And if you start lowering this, they will be affected by the fire less and less. Cool. So now they're just like flying around on their own. Maybe they're a little bit heavy. So I'll just decrease the gravity to maybe, 7. Maybe they could fly up with the fire just a little bit more. So I'll increase this just a touch. And I want these particles to emit some fire so they look like little embers. So first under emission, I only want a few thousand particles actually. So maybe around 5,000, something like that. So just a few here and there. Let's go to rendering, make them lit additive and set this to like a bright amber color. So they're nice and glowing orange. Actually, we can maybe set them to emissive, but turn off inject scattering. So now you have these nice emissive particles, but they're not affecting the look of the smoke. I think we can turn up the emissive boost a little. Maybe a darker orange. I wouldn't mind them being different sizes. So under shape, we can just increase the range of the size limit. So some of them are bigger and some are smaller. As always, I would like them to get small before they die. We will always do this pretty much. So now they beautifully disappear into the smoke. And finally, injection. I just want to inject some flames, so maybe 10%. And they can give the fire a little bit of velocity, so maybe 20% over here. And here you go. Here are some nice flaming ember GPU particles on top of our car fire. Now let's just make the car darker because the white is just so bad. So I'll just make this like a dark gray for the car. And I think we can adjust our line force so that it's pointing more upwards. So W to rotate and just rotate it up like this. I just think the fire is a bit too big because of those GPU particles injecting all those flames and the temperature. So I'll just set the temperature to be a random per particle and lower the range from, 4,000 to maybe like 3,000. And maybe these particles could also die sooner. So life, let's drag the range down. And finally, active forces. Let's just see what it looks like if we increase the volume and how much they're following the fire. I want some of them to be falling on the ground, but not too many. Nice, so I think these values seem to work for me, around 70 to 80 for the volume, or the advection in other words. So I just have these few particles always shooting down and touching the ground when they die off, but most of them go up with the fire. One more thing we can do to randomize this even more is add a modulator to the fuel emission so that it's not always burning at the same rate, even though it's already pretty broken up with everything we did. I just want to show you that. So emission fuel rate, let's expose the pin, and I'll drag out a oscillator. And so now the fuel rate is cycling pretty fast. I'll just set it to a random noise, and I don't want it to be as fast, so we can just lower the frequency to maybe just like 0.1 or 0.2. And so now the fuel rate is cycling anywhere from 350 to 600, and it just adds that nice variation. I think we can lower the base a little bit so that it's less overall. So now it cycles from around 200 to 450. Okay, so let's try maybe 440 for the base. 375. Cool, I think that's my favorite so far. I mean, you could do the same thing for maybe the additional pressure rate. So let's expose that pin to copy this oscillator, plug it into this. Yeah, so now that's gonna be pretty messed up. So I'll just set the base to be, I think it was at 20. And now we're getting these random explosions. So I want the amount to be very low, so maybe just 5%. So now it's cycling from 0 to 50, and we're getting these sort of random explosions. I think even that maybe is too much. So let's just do 2.5% for the amount. Nice, so it's cycling from around 20 to 40. I think I still wouldn't mind there being even more smoke. So I'll set the smoke rate to 250. Let me pause the simulation, go into shading, smoke. And I want to darken the smoke overall. So I'll just darken this and darken the first color as well. So it's almost pure black. And I want to increase the smoke density over here until it looks like thicker smoke. So maybe let's do 150%. And let's add that nice backlight to this. So I'll just lower the directional light intensity to maybe just 1.5. Make a new light, make it a spot. I'll increase the intensity to 50. Make it a nice bluish color. And let's move this light to the back. Rotate it. Make it face the smoke. Increase the intensity even more to maybe 150. Move it sort of behind the smoke, increase the cone angle so it lights up everything. And I definitely want the smoke to be even thicker. So shading, smoke density scale, just keep increasing that, 270%. And now we can just go into the scattering and increase the scattering occlusion so that the shadows are a bit thicker. Also, let's decrease the direct light contribution. Let's also increase the smoke shadow intensity and the shadow density. Or you know what, I'll just get rid of this oscillator. It's just not really working for me. I just wanted to show you that that's something you can do. I'll just leave it at that 40% where we had it before. And finally, we can just play with the gradient for the smoke. So I just loaded up the gradient that I used. I will include this with the course. And if you want to brighten up the fire, you can just increase the shaping by flames to introduce some more brightness to it, 2700%. And finally, we can go into the scene node, crank up the bloom for this one and the bloom radius so it's nice and glowy. And here you go. This will be our final result. We covered a lot of different techniques over here. The shape blend, some noises, oscillators, color gradients, all the good stuff. So I'll see you in the next one. Alright, so one of my personal favorites from this entire course is this magical, toxic, radioactive blast. There's a lot going on in here, so many different emitters, different particles. We're also going to use an imported simulation of some rocks. I'll explain why in a second, just so that we can get these nice GPU particle trails. So lots to learn in this one, and let's jump right into it. Alright, once again, starting with a blank scene, we can expand the size of our grid right away. So what I did was 300 by 300 by 150. Now, one thing I want to show you is that if I just make an emitter volume and then make a shape, and let's do shape particles and just start the simulation, I have these particles emitting, which is perfect for something like a blast. But if I try to connect this shape to an emitter particles, it will connect to the mask shape, but the mask shape is not emitting. I needed to connect to the shape for it to emit particles, but it won't let me, right? So this is one of the issues that I had to face when trying to make this blast, was that you cannot emit GPU particles out of the shape particles. In other words, you can't really create nice GPU particle trails like the ones that I was after. You just are not allowed to connect it to the node. This is just not a functionality that Embergen has right now. I'm pretty sure they're gonna add it in the following version very soon, because this is something that you can do in Niagara in Unreal Engine, but you just can't do it yet in Embergen. So I had to find a different way. So what I ended up doing was I realized that you can import FBX animation or Alembic animation into Embergen, and you are allowed to emit GPU particles out of geometry. So I was like, okay, let me just make the blast in my 3D software. So I just set up this very simple rock blast, just a few particles with a simple sort of a round rock shaped geometry on them that just blasts out, and then the particles die. It's only alive for about 30 frames. So don't worry, I'm including this little rock blast Alembic file with the course, so you can just download it right under this video. For those of you who are 3ds Max and Tyflow users, I'm also including my Tyflow setup, so you can tweak it the way you would like. Now, if you are using any other different software, this is pretty much like the simplest little particle simulation that you can create in any other software. You know, Cinema 4D, Blender, Houdini. Really, you're just giving birth to some particles, giving them some speed to shoot them up, and then you just give them some gravity and collisions with the floor, and I killed them after 30 frames. So they just shoot up, fall down, collide with the floor, and die. So back in Embergen, I'll just delete these particles, reset, and instead I'll just go into import, and I just imported the dirt impact 01.abc. So that's the Alembic file that's right under this video, so you can download it and follow along with me. So here it is. It's super huge by default, and it's also too fast. So I can tell you that after a bunch of tweaking, I ended up setting the scale to 7%, and then you can override the FPS to slow it down, and I set that to 15 frames per second. So now what I'm left with, if we just change the color as well to pure white, are these nice little rocks just blasting out, and then they die after a few frames. Super simple. So now the beautiful thing is that I can just drag out of the geometry node over here and create an emitter particles, and now it will actually connect to the shape. So I can connect that to my simulation node, and now if I reset, I'm getting some beautiful GPU particles to actually show up. So it is working beautifully, but you notice right away there is that error at the very end. This is when the little rocks die. You know, Embergen doesn't really know how to deal with the geometry just disappearing from one frame to the other when it's set to be an emitter. And so it just sort of freaks out and creates these like lines on the floor that we don't want. So actually what we're gonna do is just animate the emission of the GPU particles to stop right before the rocks disappear, just to avoid this problem. So it looks like the rocks disappear right after maybe frame 120. So I'll just enable the keyframes for the continuous emission for these GPU particles and go to frame 120 and make sure that it's disabled on frame 120 and enabled right before. So now if I reset this, okay, maybe it still happens too late, so just move it forward. Perfect. So I had to move it to around frame 87. So on frame 92, the GPU particles stop emitting, which is right before the rocks disappear. And this way, when I restart, I have these beautiful trails with no error anymore. So this is good to go. Now we can just tweak how it looks. So I'll rename these as my green trails. And we can go to rendering, set them to be lit additive. And I'll just give them a nice sort of a toxic green color. And I really like when they fall down on the floor and create those nice lines. So we can go to active forces and set the gravity to maybe 20. Let's try that. Better, but let's crank it up. So I'll just do 80. See what we get with that. Nice. That's sort of what I want. I want to see these nice lines when you look at it from the top. So as always, let's make sure that the particles get nicely small before they die. So shape, size by life, set it to cosine. And make this curve down here so they get nice and small. Nice, much more elegant this way. And I think we can make them a little bit smaller, so maybe 85% for the scale. Next, they're just falling down in a very uniform way. We're gonna need a little bit of noise. So we can just make a noise that affects the whole simulation. So noise force, but you know, by default it's gonna be way too strong. So what I'll do is just actually set the amplitude to 0.05 and the animation speed also to 0.05. So this should just be some very, very subtle noise. Now they're just moving around a little bit as they're falling down. All right, so once you're happy with the green particles, we're gonna add one more color. So we can just copy this, Control V, F2, rename it as yellow trails and connect it to this node and to the simulation node. So now we're gonna have two of them right on top of each other. So actually what we need to do is copy this import node, connect the yellow particles to this one, and we need to rotate this one a little bit on the Z. Let's do 90 degrees. And now we can change the color of the yellow particles to some nice darker yellow, something like this, and reset, and voila. Here you have your green and yellow particles together. So when I got this far into the setup, I was like, okay, this does look awesome, but there's just too much going on. There's too many trails right now. And I would really like for the yellow trails to maybe have a slightly different speed and behave slightly differently than the green trails. But because this is an exact copy of each other, I wasn't really getting that. So I actually ended up making another version of these rocks. It's also included under the video, and it's called Dirt Impact 01B. So for this second one, for the yellow particles, I'll just change it from Dirt Impact 01 to Dirt Impact 01B. And now when I reset, I have way fewer yellow particles because, you know, I just exported a second version of this where I just had less particles and I had them affected by gravity a bit more. So then when you put it all together, you end up with something like this. So now, of course, the beauty of having it in two different nodes is that we can have the yellow particles maybe die sooner. So I can go to life and just kill them a bit sooner. So just move the range to maybe 2 to 3.5. And now the yellow trails will start dying off sooner than the green trails, which makes for a more gradual, nice look for everything. So this is enough for this video, and in the next one we're gonna start adding the smoke blast. Okay, continuing with this toxic blast setup, I would like to create some smoke trails on top of these particle trails. So I'll just turn off the particle trails and copy my import 01. So this is the Dirt Impact 01. Just Control C, Control V over here. drag from geometry, and let's make an emitter volume because we want to create smoke. Connect that to my simulation node. Emission, I don't want any fuel and I don't want any temperature. And for the smoke rate, we can do 50%. So now when I reset, I just have some nice smoke being created over here. Now let's make the smoke green. So shading, smoke, color ramp. Let's make it a nice sort of a dark toxic green. The second color can maybe be a little bit lighter. And I would like the smoke to dissipate pretty fast so it doesn't get too messy. So under simulation, combustion, I will increase the smoke dissipation to 80%. So now we get these nice trails, but they dissipate pretty fast. And the cool thing is that if you enable the particles right now, they will be advected by the smoke. So we're gonna get some nice behavior in the particles now as they're being carried away by the smoke. And finally, we can work on adding the actual blast in the middle. So there are two main ways to make an explosion in EmberGen. First one is using GPU particles as the emitter. That's the preferred way that will give you the best detail. But I want you to know how to make it both ways. So in this case, we'll just use the traditional way of using the emitter volume. So I'll just make a new emitter volume connected to my simulation node. And for the shape, I want to do a blend. That's how we're gonna break up the explosion to not be just like a uniform ball. And again, for shape B, we can do noise, and for shape A, I'll do a primitive. I've tried all of the different types of geometry, and you'll pretty much get the nicest, most broken up explosion if you just set this to torus. So I'll turn off everything else again so we can focus just on this. Set the visuals, show emitters, move it above the ground. We're gonna need this to be much smaller, so we can just set the minor radius to 0.4 and the major radius to 0.8. So we just have this donut right here in the middle of our explosion. And we need these holes in the donut to be much bigger so we get a nice broken up explosion. So I'll increase the scale of the noise to increase the gaps inside of it. And so for the emitter emission, I want to emit fuel, so we can set that to 200. I don't want too much smoke, so 10% is fine, temperature is fine. And let's give it an additional pressure rate of 400. And instead of animating all of these values individually, we're just gonna animate the activity for the entire node. So I'll just enable keyframes for this, and let's rename it our main blast. So here I can find it easily in the timeline, main blast, and I'll just make a keyframe right here to turn it off and on after a certain time. So on frame 0, it can be enabled, it remains enabled for a few frames, and then it gets disabled on the last keyframe. Let's turn off all the geometry for the rocks too, that's distracting, and here we go. Reset. Okay, so it's doing something, and again I found that this is because of the random pressure intensity. So again, under emission, we need to keep lowering this random pressure until we get a more uniform explosion. So maybe set it to like 30%, and you should get a more uniform blast. Awesome. That's pretty much exactly what we need. So I can just turn off the display for the emitter and the visuals. Don't show emitter anymore. And I want to break this up with even more noise. So I'll just drag from the forces, make another noise force. That seemingly didn't do much. So what we can do is add another noise to the whole simulation. So the first noise that we made was just for the particle trails. So let's rename it that, noise trails. And let's set it to affect just the particles, while this one will be noise blast. And let's make that affect just the volume. And I will animate the force activity to only be active for the first few frames when the explosion is happening. So same as with the explosion, it's active from frame 0 to this frame, which is like frame 10, and then it gets disabled on frame 14. So we definitely have some nice additional detail in the explosion right now. And if you want to make sure that it's working, you can just extend these keyframes. And you can tell that it's being affected by the noise for sure. The noise could be a little bit smaller and a little bit stronger. So let's do 3 for the amplitude. And here we go. We're getting some nice broken up random explosion. And just to match the look of everything, let's make the flames green too. So color gradient, it's mainly this color that's affecting it. So I'll make it a nice toxic green. Maybe make this one green as well. And maybe this one can stay more in the orange territory. All right, so let's enable everything and see what it looks like all together at this point. Beautiful. So the explosion gets broken up even more with the smoke trails and everything affecting each other. And this is very close to my final result at this point. So of course the colors of everything are up to you. Feel free to play around. I'll just hit B to hide the brackets, and we can crank up the sharpening for the flames. Add our regular sharpening as well for the smoke. Go to scene, maybe give it a little bit of bloom intensity so that it glows. Also we can boost the saturation to make it even more toxic. And I will darken the ground a little bit more. Or actually, I mean, you can just turn off the ground to get the most contrast with just a black background. So make sure you're saving your work. Control spacebar. And here we are. So if you're tired of hitting R on your keyboard again to make it happen, you can just hit L, extend this a little bit, and now it will just loop for you and it will keep exploding and disappearing on top of each other. Boom, boom. So that's too soon. Move this one over here maybe. Yep, the first one disappears and second one appears. So let it play through one more time for you. That's it, definitely one of my favorites in the course, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so this will be the Osprey engine on fire example. Now at this point in the course, we have covered everything that you need to create something like this. So if you break it down into its individual elements, we have the engine on fire, which is actually almost exactly the same setup as the car on fire over here. We have these little GPU particles flying off of it. We covered all of that. Then I have some vertex color masks. So the rotors are the same. They're just spinning in a different direction, right? So the rotor is painted green and only the tip of it is painted red. So then I just have fire coming out of the tip of the rotor. And there really isn't much more going on than that. So I'll just go through the setup and point out a few things. And if anything is unclear, I would encourage you to go back to the earlier lessons where we covered vertex color masking or GPU particle injection, all that. So I will include this project file with the course. I'm gonna give you the Osprey model as well as the rotors, so you can, look through this for yourself if you would like. I'm just gonna walk you through this right now. It's really not as bad as it seems. So first thing, in my 3D software, I just made this one big piece of geometry for just the body of the Osprey. So I attached all of the pieces of the geometry together. So it's just one big piece of geo, and it's everything except for the rotors. And I just imported that into Embergen. That's the Osprey body 01.fbx. Again, it's included with this course, so just download it under this video. Now, as you can see, I have some vertex color masking over here. So the engine is painted red, and that's just so that I can enable this. And I have some fire coming just out of the engine. Now, as you can see, it's being pushed up, and that's because of the line force. So we've also covered this many times. I just have the push strength set to 0.3, nothing else. And it's just pushing the fire up to make it look, of course, like the airplane is falling down. Now, there's a lot going on to break up this fire so that the fire looks not so uniform. So one thing you may not know about is that you can actually use the shape blend for your imported geometry as well. So the engine itself is actually broken up with this animated noise. Next, I have this noise plugged into the emitter, so it's nicely broken up with noise right when it's born. And I also added an oscillator for the fuel rate, so the amount of fuel is alternating up and down with this oscillator. You can see fuel rate over here is going from 80 to 200%. We have also covered how to do this earlier in the course. So again, I'm trusting that you've watched the course up until this point and you know what I'm talking about. If anything is confusing, please go back. I know that there's always somebody skipping around the course. So I also have some additional pressure rate, just making the fire expand around the engine a bit more and give me these little nice explosions going off. So once I was happy with this, I added the GPU particles. I can show you just the particles alone. Just regular GPU particles with some injection on them. So I'm injecting smoke, temperature, I'm injecting fuel, flames, no velocity because I just wanted them to create trails. I could set their mode to be additive instead of translucent and they would be a lot brighter, but sometimes less is more. So I just wanted it to be pretty subtle. If you combine it with the fire, you get this nice little effect. Next up are the rotors. I exported just one rotor as a separate FBX. So it's the Osprey rotor 01.fbx, also included under this video for you to download. So if I just enable that, when you first open this project file, the rotors might not be there. So just go into the node and click on re-import and that should make it show up. Also, when I first loaded it in, the rotor may show up in a different place. So all you have to do is just use the arrows to line it back up with your engine. So I just manually lined it up just like this because I knew I wanted to use oscillators to make the rotor spin. So I wouldn't have to deal with an animation, that will end after a few hundred frames or whatever. I just wanted them to spin in sort of a procedural way. So I just exposed the rotation pin like we have done several times in the course as well, plugged it into a modulator cycle, and then you can just play with the frequency over here to control how fast it's spinning. So if I increase the frequency, it's gonna make the engine spin faster and faster. I ended up settling at 0.4 for that. And I'm using two different masks over here. So the first mask is set to vertex color red, and that's just the red tip. So my mask 1 is going into my emitter volume, which is just emitting some, fuel and smoke, creating this nice trail. And then I have my mask 2. My mask 2 is the green one, so that's the rest of the rotor. And I wanted the rotor to collide with the smoke. So if you pay attention to this area right here, the rotor is actually hitting the smoke and just sort of like breaking up the trail a little bit. So I just have my regular collider plugged into mask 2 and plug that into the simulation node, of course, so that the green rotor is colliding with the smoke. Super simple. And then I was like, well, I need the second rotor too, but instead of exporting another rotor, I just copied this one. So this one is actually just a copy, and I inverted the modulator. So here you can actually say invert it, right? So this is normal, they're all spinning the same way. Set it to invert it and it's just gonna spin the other way. And that's pretty much the setup, guys. So if I just enable everything, I of course just added some basic noise to the emitter for the rotor flame. You can look at my settings over here. I think it's just default. And then I still wanted there to be even more noise breaking up the fire in this area. So I added 2 more noises and connected their mask shapes to the shape primitive. So if I just say collider, you can see I just have this sphere around everything, and these 2 noises are only active inside of this sphere. So this is the force masking that we also covered, I think like 10 or 15 videos ago, so you know how to do this. So that's it. It's really a very simple setup once you break it down, just 2 pieces of geometry and some regular emitters and particles, nothing we haven't done before. So again, I'm including the project file for everything if you'd like to look through this, and we're gonna continue in the next video. Alright, so in this example, we're gonna work on this large scale explosion. We have a lot going on over here. So it's the main blast, then we also have this shockwave blast on the ground. We also have some particle trails sort of shooting through the fire. And we have some GPU particles over here creating some nice embers just flying through the smoke. So let's jump right into it. We want this to be a large scale explosion, so I'll make our voxel size 0.3 meters, and I'm gonna make this 400 by 400 by 275. Apply new resolution, so we have this ginormous grid. So we've already covered how to make a basic explosion in the toxic blast, but in this example we're gonna use GPU particles to make a much more detailed explosion. So for my emitter, I want to do a emitter particles, and I want to emit these particles out of a primitive. We can make it a sphere, and I'll just make this sphere a little bit bigger. So I did 3.5 meters, just move it above the ground, but we need this to be a quick burst of particles. So in the emitter emission, I want this to be a burst emission and turn off continuous emission. And really 1,000,000 particles is unnecessarily many. We can just set this to 125,000 particles for that burst. Now I need these particles to explode from the center out. So initial forces, velocity from position, and now you can increase these emission speed limits. So I actually did 80 for the maximum and around 15 for the minimum. So this gives me a nice range of speeds, and I'm just getting this nice quick blast of particles. I just need them to die very quickly. So under lifetime, I actually did 0.25 for the minimum and the same for the maximum. So 0.25. So now it's just this quick burst and they die right away. You can go under rendering and just make them pure white additive so you can see them much clearer. And before I forget, let's go to active forces volume. And since we're going to be adding more emitters, I don't want these particles to be affected by any other smoke. So I'll just lower the volume or the advection all the way down. Maybe we can just leave it at 0 to 10%. So this will actually affect the blast right away, and they're sort of expanding a bit further, but that's fine. We can adjust everything later. For now, let's bring in that fire and smoke. So under injection, I want 100% of smoke. I want a random temperature per particle. Let's do 100% for fuel, 100% for flames, and 100% for velocity. And so right away, when you hit reset, you're gonna get a pretty nice blast. Obviously, it looks like a cube because all of the particles are coming out at about the same speed and the same way. So what we need to do now is just add a whole bunch of noise to make this look more random. So let's go under rendering, and we can turn off rendering for the particles so we just see the fire. And I'll go into the simulation node and drag out a new noise force. I want it to affect just the particles. So since we're gonna add more noises, let's rename this as noise particles. And I need this to be very strong. So amplitude, we can do 50, and we can do 15 for the scale. And now when I reset, you're gonna get this nice random blast. Of course, you can just change the seed to get a slightly different looking result. And just to show you, if I keep decreasing the amplitude, you can see what kind of an effect that has. You're gonna get more and more sort of a uniform shape. And the more amplitude you add, the more random and broken up the explosion will be, with these nice sort of plumes coming on the sides, as you can see. You can also play with the scale to control the size of these plumes. So if I increase the scale way higher, you're gonna get just this, maybe one big giant plume coming to the side. If instead I set this to maybe 5 for the scale, you're gonna get a whole bunch of small ones. So this is the quickest, easiest way to get some very nice detailed explosions. I'll set this back to 15, and the amplitude maybe we can leave at 40. Maybe change the seed until we get a result that we like. Alright, so next up, I want to add a nice big shockwave. So let's turn off this. Let's rename it main explosion. And I'll just copy this one, shockwave, connect it to my emitter, and copy the primitive. So this is our sphere, Control C, Control V, and this will be our torus. Connect that to our shockwave, set the type to be a torus, turn off everything else. And so now by default, we have the same explosion, except it's coming out of a torus instead of a sphere. So already it's sort of sticking to the ground and looking a bit more like a shockwave. So I don't really want to emit any flames. I just want to emit smoke. So injection, I'll turn off the fuel, set it to 0, and set the flames to 0 also. And I really want this shockwave to expand a lot. So I'll set the velocity to 200%. So we're getting something like this. So I want these particles to be alive for even a shorter time, so it doesn't have time to get affected by the noise and shoot up so high. So under life, we can just set this to maybe 0.15 for the minimum and 0.15 for the maximum. I will also reduce the range of the speed so that they all are faster. And this will give me a stronger shockwave overall. So maybe just move this range over here. And I'll increase the speed scale to maybe 2. So now we're starting to get a pretty big shockwave. Maybe 2 is too much, so 1.7, and give it just a little bit of range. And to give it even more visual flair, we can crank up the amount of particles. So under emission, burst size, let's increase this to maybe 700,000 particles. Let's go back to life and extend the maximum lifetime to maybe 0.3. See what that will do for a change. All right, so now we're really getting a huge shockwave. That might actually be starting to be a little too big. So maybe decrease the speed scale to 1.3, lower the emission speed limits a little bit. All right, so I do like this shockwave as far as the amount of smoke, the force, the size, and everything. The only thing I don't like is that there's still a bunch of smoke shooting too high up for my taste. So what we can do is actually just crank up the gravity for the particles way higher, and this will force the particles to stay to the ground. Enable the rendering for the particles so we can see them for the time being. I just want to show you, this is what the particles look like right now, right? That's the problem, that some of these particles go too high. So active forces, gravity intensity, let's set it to 800. And now you see the particles are just gonna be forced to stay lower to the ground. Maybe that's too much, so we can like keep lowering it until we get something we like. Maybe 300. Okay, I think 300 is a good amount. So I'll just turn off the rendering for the particles again. And let's enable our main explosion and watch it all together. And here we go. So the reason why there's still fire in the shockwave is because the shockwave particles just take the fire along with them, right? Everything affects everything. So you're gonna get some of those fire plumes going along with the shockwave. And we're gonna continue with this setup in part 2. All right, so this is where we are at with our explosion right now. Just want to recap that if you want to change the seed for all of the values at once and get just a slightly different result, you can click on this casino cube icon, which will change the seed for all parameters. And now you're gonna get a slightly different explosion. And if it's broken up too much for your taste, you can just go into the noise for the particles that we created and lower the amplitude to maybe 30. And this will give you a slightly more uniform explosion. So that's entirely up to you for the look that you're going for. I also want to point out that by default in our blank scene that we've been using, our buoyancy is set to 0, right? So the explosion is not really rising up, but you can just set this to, let's say, 50%, and now the file will rise up. So that's actually not a bad number. I think I'm gonna leave it at 50. So obviously the smoke is too thin, so it doesn't really make sense for such a huge explosion for the smoke to be so transparent and all that. But we're gonna play with the shading node last. For now, I want to add the smoke particle trails and the embers. So let's turn off everything again while we work on this. And I'll make a new emitter volume and make a new shape particles. So by default, we just have these few particles shooting up in the air. The burst size we can set to maybe 60 total particles. For the initial speed type, I want to do velocity cone so that they actually go out at an angle in all directions. And let's keep increasing the speed scale until we see them shooting up much higher. Okay, not bad. I think I'll set the speed scale to maybe 10. And I don't want to emit any fuel out of them. I just want smoke. So emitter, emission, no emission for the fuel. And I want these to create like a thick smoke trail. So we can crank up the smoke rate to actually 1,000. And we're gonna get something like this. Now the problem right now is that the smoke is being given velocity from the particles, right? So it's creating these puffs. So we need to set the velocity transfer here lower. If you set it to 0, you're gonna get just perfect trails that are a bit too perfect. So I recommend that you set this to around 20% so that the smoke does have a little bit of velocity going forward, but not too much. Maybe let's try 15. Cool. And you know, obviously they're just not being affected by gravity enough. So back in shape, let's set the gravity to -100. All right, we're starting to get something, but now they're sort of not shooting up high enough. So it's just a constant back and forth. Maybe set the gravity to -75. Double the maximum speed to 10. Increase the minimum speed a little bit. And here we go. We're starting to get some nice smoke trails. Let's see if adding some noise will add to break up these trails a little bit. So let's add a noise to this emitter. Yeah, that helped a little bit. But I think we also need to give them different sizes and sort of randomize things a little bit more. So let's increase this dragging range. That's sort of like adding drag force in any other software. It's gonna slow them down over time. The good thing is that it gives us a range, which means that each one will be slowed down at a different rate. So I'll set this to maybe 15%. That actually made a huge difference. You see how some of them slow down right away, but some of them shoot up really high. So this value makes a huge difference. So I'll just set it to maybe 3%. Awesome. Definitely a big difference. They have much more random movement to them. Okay, next up, just going down the settings over here, we have the chaos range. So right now they're still going in sort of this perfect arch and they're not really affected by wind or anything, it seems. So we can increase this chaos range. And I found that you can actually increase this pretty high. So you can set the maximum to 1,000 just to demonstrate how that works. You see at 1,000, they're just sort of crazy, just sort of, you know, wobbling around. So obviously 1,000 is too much, but we can lower this to maybe 300 and set the minimum to like 150. And now they have a little bit of wobbling motion as they're flying. You know, you don't want to overdo this because it is a bit unrealistic, but we're just trying to add some randomness to them. So maybe set this lower to, you know, let's do 70 to 150%. Next up, as you're noticing, there's this puffiness going on sort of around them. And this is controlled by the capsule stretching. So this will stretch the particles depending on how fast they are. We don't really want that, so I'll just set it to 0. And now watch how we're gonna get these basically perfect trails without any puffiness. So I think I actually want a little bit of it. So I'll just set this to maybe 70%. That's too much, 30%. Nice. And finally, I also want to change their size. So they already have a size range. I would like to extend that size range and make them mostly a bit smaller. So maybe we can do 0.15 minimum and 0.5 maximum for the size. Awesome, so some of them are now visibly thicker and some are thinner. And I think we could do with even more trails. So let's just increase the amount from 60 to 85, why not? We also have this option to modulate their size by their life. So I'll just check it and we're gonna get this graph that we're already used to from our GPU particles. So I'll just set it to cosine and I want them to start big and then get small toward the end of their life. So you can just flip the curve basically. And now what happens, as you see, it's really beautiful to watch. Especially these ones, you see they get very, very thin until they almost disappear before they die. So as you can see right now, they're not colliding with the floor properly. They just sort of fly through the floor. So we can say collision with Z ground, collide, and then we can lower the bounciness way lower. So I'll just set it to maybe 15% and increase the friction. And now they hit the floor, they bounce a little bit, and then they disappear. So let me just enable everything we have so far. So main explosion, shockwave, and this one will be our smoke trails. Reset, and bam, we have some beautiful smoke trails sort of shooting through our explosion. I think they could be even faster so that they're more visible. So I'll just go to shape particles, speed scale. Let's set that to 15 and see how far they'll go. Awesome. And you know what? I wouldn't mind having even more of them. Maybe set the speed scale to 14 and increase the amount to 110. And I think I wouldn't mind them going in more like wider direction, right? They're sort of just shooting up. I want them to go to the sides too. So we can increase the cone spreading over here to maybe 65 degrees. And now they're gonna shoot up in a wider radius. Beautiful. So in the next video, we're gonna continue by adding some embers and additional detail. So the final detail I wanna add to a large scale explosion are the embers, just sort of flying everywhere through the smoke. So we can just copy our sphere over here that we're using for the main explosion, copy it down here, connect it to a emitter particles, connect that to our simulation node. Let's rename this as our embers. Go under rendering, let's make it additive. And the initial color can just be a nice sort of ember orange. And for the emission, I want it to be just a burst emission, not continuous emission. 250,000 particles to start. Let's just run the sim and see what this looks like by default. Yeah, I can see there's some particles here. So first thing, maybe let's try and just change this emitter to a torus. Maybe move it slightly above the ground even more, because I don't really want a lot of these embers to stay stuck to the floor like this. I don't like that. Let's turn off the main explosion and just focus on the shockwave and the smoke trails. Reset. Cool. So this is starting to look better. I don't really want them to be rising up as much, so let's give them more gravity, so maybe 50 for the gravity. Let's try have them be affected by the smoke even more, so extend the volume range over here higher. See what we get. Yeah, awesome. So now they're beautifully being carried away by the plumes. That's sort of what I want to see. Nice. So let's just make them bigger under shape, scale multiplier. Maybe I'll go for 200%, but extend the size limit ranges so that we have different sizes. Definitely want them to get small before they die as always. So set this to cosine, make a new point, drag this down. And I don't want them to be alive for as long, so we can just have them be alive for maybe 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, something like that. See what we get here. All right, so it's not bad. It's just that there's too many of them on the floor. So I think what we can do is just go under collisions, ground bound, and set this to kill, so that if they touch the floor or they want to go through the floor, they'll just be killed. And the effect this has is that there's just way fewer of them, you know, stuck around the floor, just like I wanted. So now let's turn on the actual explosion and watch this all together. Cool. So once the explosion is sort of done exploding, there's just a bunch of these embers floating around, just like I wanted to, especially in this smoke. Now they're just sort of flashing on that first frame. So let's see if we can fix that with the size over life under shape. If we make them small before they're born, let's see if that might help. Just maybe make another point here and just make them invisible for the first few frames. Yeah, that helped. Awesome. So now we have a whole bunch of embers in our explosion. I think we can have them die even faster. So I'll just go to the life and lower their lifetime even more. So maybe just 1 to 1.7. I would like the shock waves to maybe catch more of them. So let's increase the radius of this torus more. So I'll just increase this, the minor and the major radius, see if they'll do anything. And it did. Awesome. So now the shock wave is catching more of the particles than it was before. So at this point, I just don't like that all of the embers are the same color. So we've already learned how to apply a different color to particles randomly. So I'll just set the initial color to random per particle, expose the initial color, and drag out a new gradient. I'll just load my basic orange gradient into this and just modify the colors a little bit to get some nice sort of ember colors that are different. Maybe like a darker orange over here. Maybe avoid the red, just push it more toward orange. Awesome, so now each ember is a slightly different hue of orange. I still think we could have more of them. So emission, burst size, let's do 400,000. And I still feel like they could be a bit brighter. So we can just go under rendering, make them emissive, but turn off the inject scattering. And now we have these really bright embers going through everything. Definitely too bright. So maybe around 2000% or 1500% for the brightness. And here you go. I think this is very close to our final result. Now this is optional, but as a final touch, if you wanted to, you could add some fire trails as well instead of just the smoke trails. So we can just copy our smoke trails over here, all 3 nodes, paste it over here. Let's rename this as fire trails. Connect that to our simulation node. And I don't want these to go as high. So I'll just lower the speed scale to maybe 8, but I do want them to spread out more to the sides. So I'll increase the cone spreading to maybe 120 degrees. Under emission, I do want to emit fuel this time. So let's just set it to add. Maybe set the fuel rate to 100, 300 for the smoke. Nice. So now we're getting some trails on fire over here as well. Now to make them different for the smoke trails, you can make them thicker. So we can just go under shape and increase the size range, maybe double it. And here you go, pretty cool. Maybe these fire trails can die sooner. So I'll just decrease the life range by ½ a second. I still feel like maybe they could be a bit thicker. And I'll crank up the fuel rate to 300. And maybe give it just like 1% of additional pressure rate, because why not? Because it's a huge explosion after all. And here you go. Some beautiful fire trails, smoke trails, shockwave, embers, everything together. Now final touches, the shading. Finally we're gonna get to this. So smoke, I would say let's make the smoke darker. And let's definitely make the smoke thicker. So smoke density scale. Gonna increase this to maybe, let's see, 200%. Maybe go under lighting and increase the shadow density for the smoke. That darkens it too. Beautiful. Now it's starting to have that large scale thickness that we need to see. we can increase the contribution of the flames light onto the smoke. So as I increase this, the flames brighten up the smoke around them a bit more. That's a pretty cool effect. So maybe 200% for that. And then under flames, we can increase shaping by flames. This will brighten up the flames a little bit, make it look hotter. So we're getting this very sort of bright, hot explosion. Let's play with the gradient. So I'll move some of these colors closer together. And I think I would like to introduce more sort of a red when the fire is dying off. So I'll just double click here and make more like a fiery red orange. You see what that's doing as I'm like bringing that orange into the explosion. And I do feel like maybe it's a bit too bright for those first few frames. So we can bring more saturation into this color too, to sort of make it more orangey instead of white. So really at this point, you know, you would just find the kind of reference that you're trying to replicate, start matching the colors to your reference. You know, I'm just sort of playing around, seeing what kind of looks cool to me. Now, as a final touch, I think we could break up this explosion even more with some extra additional noise. So what you can do is copy this noise particles, Control V. Let's rename it noise volume. And instead of mode particles, I want to affect just the fire and smoke connected to my simulation. And I will only want this to be active for first few frames. So emitter activity, set a keyframe, and maybe make it stop after around frame 70. So disabled over here. Yeah, so that's still way too strong. So we can set the amplitude to just maybe 2 and move these keyframes closer. So that just breaks everything up. I think it can only be active for the first few frames. Maybe the first 20 frames or so. Just some extra noise. That just really beautifully breaks up the fire trails and the smoke trails. I still think it's too strong, so final touch, I'll move it even closer to 0. And maybe set the amplitude to just 1. Just something pretty subtle. I'm mainly looking at the trails and at how much the smoke trails are getting broken up. So after you're happy with everything, we can go to the rendering, Raymark sharpening, crank this up to maybe 300% for the flames and the smoke, volume processing, add a sharpening in here too, maybe just 80%. We can definitely give it some bloom so that the explosion glows. And let's increase the contrast just a touch. Okay, so maybe that's too bright, so I'll just lower the intensity to maybe 0.8 and 0.8 for the radius as well. So this is what I'm looking at right now. Maybe the trails are a bit too much, like maybe there are too many. I just love them, but I think there are too many. But that's an easy fix. Just find your smoke trails and set the burst size to maybe 80 instead of 110. Finally, we can just add some nicer lighting to this to make it stand out. So lights, let's make a spotlight. I will make it a nice bluish color. Raise the intensity all the way to 50 and move this spotlight back here. Rotate it toward my explosion. Maybe intensity needs to be 100. Make it even more blue. And I'll just rotate it at my explosion. Increase the cone angle a lot. And now if you look at it from the back, you're gonna start seeing that nice sort of backlight illumination. And maybe copy it one more time. Connect it to the light node. Let's make this one maybe in the more orange hues. And move it to the side. Rotate it to face the explosion this way. Yeah, so we need to make this light even bigger, the blue one. So not as saturated, but move it back. And let's increase the intensity to 500. Yeah, I just love how the backlight just makes these nice little details and the trails stand out so much. So final touch, I set it to 1000. Maybe I'll make it a little bit more blue, and the orange light can have more intensity as well, maybe 200, but this one can be more maybe white-ish, just slightly orange. Hide the brackets with B, Control spacebar. So I think this will be my final result for this explosion. There's always more we could add. We could add even more fire trails maybe on the ground, you know, add more GPU particles, add a secondary blast after the main blast. But I'm pretty happy with this one. I think that you guys learned a lot from this, and I'll see you in the next video.